Okay, ladies and gentlemen, super excited to bring you this video. It's going to be a little different than usual. Instead of focusing on individual players and diving into their statistics, their usage trends, and maybe guys that are moving up rankings versus down rankings, I'm going to dive into general strategy to dominate your 2022 fantasy football playoff season, the kind of bench allocation that you want to be having in terms of depth versus top end studs. We are going to get into all of it, but before we get into anything, make sure you go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down there in the comments. And also, if you want to check out any of these player props, you can find a link to Underdog Fantasy down there in the comment section and in the description of the video. When you sign up for Underdog with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100. So deposit 10 bucks, you'll immediately have 20 in your account. And also, only with promo code FLOCK are you going to get this a free Patrick Mahomes bet. I'm no mathematician, but I bet you Patrick Mahomes is going to be able to get to 1 passing yard against the Cincinnati Bengals here. So make sure you're taking advantage of that, and let's go through and let's dive into what we have with this fantasy football playoff strategy. But before we even dive into the strategy itself, I want to make sure that we have our fantasy football playoffs set up correctly. Okay, I know maybe it's too late to go through and change this season, but if you're a league commissioner, if you can talk to your league commissioner about setting it up correctly for next year, it's going to be something you want to do. The biggest mistake I see people making is having their fantasy football playoffs run until the last week of the season. Oh, do not be doing this. Please don't be playing in week 18 this year. Now, it's going to be less of an issue because NFL teams only have one team per conference that actually gets a bye, so not going to be as big of a deal as what you had in years past. But there is still always going to be unique scenarios where a team is locked into an individual seed where they're going to go through and they're going to say, okay, yeah, Patrick Mahomes, you can play for the first half. Travis Kelce, you can play for the first half. But after that, we are going to sit you. And if you're playing in your fantasy football championship and the best of the best players are going to sit out for no apparent reason, that's just something you don't want to deal with. You don't want to have that headache. So please make sure your fantasy football playoffs are going to end in week 17. And if you're just going through and setting up your playoff bracket, make sure that if you're in a 12-team league, that 6 teams make the playoffs. The top 2 teams get a bye. And then from there, obviously, it works itself out. If you're playing in a 10-team league, you have a little more flexibility on how you want to do it. If you want to make the playoffs very important in the regular season, not as important, you could go through and make it where 6 teams still make it in the playoffs. Top 2 teams get a bye, but then almost everybody makes it in the playoffs. What you can also do if you're in a 10-team league and you want to make the regular season very important is you could shorten the fantasy football playoff stretch from a course of 3 weeks down to 2 and only make it where the top 4 teams from the regular season get into the fantasy football playoffs. Those are some mandatory rules, in my opinion. We can have some small little suggestions I really like if you can set up your league in a way where the top seed gets to pick their opponent each week, that would really incentivize people to go through and prioritize the regular season, but at the same time, make sure they're scoring points in the fantasy football playoffs. I really like that little wrinkle. But outside of that, let's go through and let's dive into what you should be doing this year to make sure that you're winning your fantasy football playoffs. First thing that we need to be doing is something we started doing a few weeks back. I think we had our first fantasy football playoff video about a month ago at this point, where you're analyzing fantasy football playoff schedules. Now, I think this is going to be important, but only on the extremes. What I really don't want you to do is go through and create a little cheat sheet for yourself and go, okay, Cordell Patterson has the 12th best fantasy football schedule for running backs, whereas Jamal Williams has the 9th best fantasy football schedule for running backs, and then really go through and nitpick down to that level. No, you shouldn't do it, but you should have a great understanding of the extremes. You should be able to look at a player like Derrick Henry that gets to go up against the Los Angeles Chargers and the Houston Texans, and now he has a cakewalk of a fantasy football playoff schedule. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, look at a player like Joe Mixon, who just has brutal matchup after brutal matchup after brutal matchup. Those players on the extremes, the players with the top 5 schedules and the bottom 5 schedules, that is going to be something we have to be on the lookout for with how we're constructing our team and our trades as we approach the fantasy football playoffs. Now, one thing that I also want to do when we're looking at individual players is going to be focusing in on players that are actually on NFL teams that have something to play for. Because, of course, this isn't college. You're not going to get all of a sudden Najee Harris saying, okay, well, the Pittsburgh Steelers aren't making the playoffs, so I'm done for the season. I'm sitting out. That's not going to happen straight up. But what may very well happen is a running back like Najee Harris goes through and has an abdomen injury. And instead of him going through toughing it up, pushing through it and playing through the injury, he is so much more inclined to shut it down for the season. We saw this with Joe Mixon 2 years ago, back in Joe Burrow's rookie year, when Joe Burrow goes down with the torn knee. If y'all remember that season, Joe Mixon was dealing with the foot injury. They decided not even to put Joe Mixon on the short-term IR. They were calling the injury a week-to-week injury for Mixon. He was supposed to be back in about 2 weeks, but the Cincinnati Bengals were pretty much dead last in the AFC at that point, and then Joe Burrow goes down for the year. So the Cincinnati Bengals look at Joe Mixon dealing with the foot injury, and there are about 7 weeks left in the season, and they say, well, you know what? Why the hell are we bringing you back now? No, my friend. Sit down. Let's rest this season. Let's get a horrible record. Let's go select our guy, Jamar Chase, in the NFL draft. So it's not like these players are just going to sit out voluntarily because their team's not playing for anything. But when it comes to injuries and it comes to players getting shut down early, a player that is, I hate to use this example, but Najee Harris is significantly more likely to get shut down than maybe someone like Kenneth Walker's on the Seattle Seahawks fighting for the division. But going over to what we should be doing with the rest of our roster, not individual players, I want to make sure that everybody understands the mindset that we are going to be in, where obviously we just went down the stretch of the season where you're dealing with bye week after bye week after bye week, injury after injury after injury. And over the past 2 months, you really wanted to make sure that you had depth in your lineup. I mean, over the past 2 months, if you didn't have depth, you probably had some disgusting weeks where you're having to go through and start someone like Chase Claypool. And of course, I mean, you don't want to be in that position. You would rather have a lot of wide receivers. You'd rather have Juju Smith-Schuster, Terry McLaurin, Devonta Smith, Gabriel Davis, just wide receiver after wide receiver after wide receiver that are going to be a viable option to put in your starting lineup in the case of injuries and buys. Well, now after this week, you're pretty much going to be through all of the buys. Of course, we have some individual instances like Jonathan Taylor. Like, yes, there are a few number of teams that still have to go through their bye week in week 14, but it's super, super small. But you are going to be primarily through every bye week where the depth isn't going to be important for that reason. And on top of this, think about your opponents. If you're going into the fantasy football playoffs, the freebies are over. The freebies are long gone, my friend. You are going up against the best of the best. Every week, you are going to have a tough matchup with your opponent. So instead of just trying to get by, instead of just trying to go through and roster as many players like Juju Smith-Schuster, Devonta Smith as possible, we need some heavy hitters. We need an Amon-Ra St. Brown on our roster. We need to make sure that we're chasing those players that have the elite level ceilings rather than the high floors. Now, I know that you're probably already past your trade deadline, so it's not like we're going to be able to make 2-for-1 packages to go through and fix this dilemma, but something we can do down there on the bench, which is going to help us out by chasing the elite ceiling rather than the high floor. Just to give you an example of this, let's go through and let's look at 2 running backs, right? Let's look at someone named Gus Edwards, and let's look at someone named, say, Kareem Hunt. If we look at the production when both these running backs are healthy, who's probably going to be the better option week 13? Who's probably going to score more points? Gus Edwards. Or say the same thing with D'Onta Foreman, if you want to use D'Onta Foreman as an example. I can pretty much guarantee you D'Onta Foreman's going to score more than Kareem Hunt this week. But if you are rolling with a fantasy football playoff roster, like I said, for the playoffs, where you have D'Onta Foreman, you have Gus Edwards as your running back 4, as your running back 5, where they're not going to hit your starting lineup. We don't really need that depth. Should we be rostering those running backs that are getting opportunities today, but maybe have a severely capped ceiling, where there's no real path for them to actually make it into your starting lineup? I would make an argument you're much better off rostering the running backs that may not have this situation right now, But if anything happens, they have the ceiling to actually make a difference. This is going back to what we were discussing previously. We are coming to the point of the year where we're through all the bye weeks. We're going up against the heavy hitters in our league. So instead of getting that high floor player that you can start any individual week, we need the player that can break fantasy football. You need the AJ Dillon. You need the Alexander Madison. You need the Kareem Hunt. The guy that maybe is not getting involved right now, but if the starter were to go down in front of him, all of a sudden he does become a locked and loaded top 10 running back that you don't even have to think about. Of course, those are just examples. You can apply that to wide receiver. I mean, applying that to a wide receiver would be you should have dropped Curtis Samuel 2 weeks ago and gone ahead and picked up someone like Treylon Burks. And that even if Curtis Samuel had maybe a higher floor based on the target volume we had seen, we already know that Curtis Samuel doesn't have the ceiling to actually make a real difference in your lineup. Where Treylon Burks, yeah, the floor is going to be extremely low. Who the hell knows what you're going to get? But realistically speaking, those rookies like Treylon Burks, like Christian Watson, like Garrett Wilson, if they do break out down the stretch, then all of a sudden you could be looking at this year's Amon-Ra St. Brown, this year's rookie AJ Brown. So I just want to make sure that we are hitting these few boxes. We are prioritizing players that have good fantasy football playoff schedules. We are prioritizing players that are on winning NFL teams that are actually playing for something. We are going through, and most importantly, prioritizing upside, and upside, ignoring depth, as depth is not going to be important at this time of the season. But one last thing before we end the video. Y'all know I spend God knows how long every season trying to convince you not to roster 2 quarterbacks, not to roster 2 defenses, to go through the season with as many of those depth wide receiver and running backs on your roster as possible. This is getting to the point of the year where I'm fine. If you want to roster 2 quarterbacks, if you want to play the matchups, if you want to roster 2 defenses, and you want to go ahead and look at, okay, week 16, I really like the matchup for this defense, but week 15, I really like the matchup for this one. If you want to roster both of them, I'm going to be fine with that. This is also the time of the year where you can go out there and pick up that extra defense, go out there and pick up that extra quarterback, go out there and pick up that extra tight ends. I wouldn't recommend rostering 2 of every one of those positions on your team because obviously that would severely cap you. But I think that's all I got for you. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please go down there, drop a like on it, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. If you have any questions, drop them down there in the comment section. And in that comment section, you can find a link to Underdog Fantasy with all these cool player props. When you sign up with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $200. And only with promo code FLOCK are you going to get this free Patrick Mahomes bet against the Cincinnati Bengals. Super excited we were able to get you that. But I think that's all I got for you. Again, thank you so much for supporting the channel. I really hope you have a great day, and I really hope we get to see you in the live stream tonight.